Hey, did you know that in Canada, you actually don't have a constitutional right to own a firearm? Not for hunting, not for sport shooting, not even for self-defense. Definitely not for self-defense. And in Canada, firearm ownership is considered a privilege, and privileges can be revoked, as we know, which is exactly what the federal government is attempting to do now with thousands of legally owned firearms across this country. And law-abiding Canadian citizens like me followed every rule. They took safety courses, they passed background checks, they got their licenses, they stored and transported their firearms according to strict regulations, and they complied with the law. But then the government decided to change the law. And just like that, private property was perfectly legal yesterday and suddenly becomes contraband today. And that's when you realize something that most Canadians probably never stop to actually think about. Because in this country, the government ultimately decides what citizens are allowed to own. It can change classifications, it can rewrite regulations, and if it decides tomorrow that something you legally purchased is now prohibited, the expectation is that you just politely hand it over. It's just like a walk down to the nearest government collection table as if you're returning an overdue library book. And meanwhile, just a short drive south of the border, Americans have something very different written directly into their Constitution, and it's called the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. It explicitly protects the rights of citizens to keep and bear arms, not as a privilege granted by the government, but as a right that the government is forbidden from infringing upon. So you got two neighboring countries, two completely different philosophies. In one country, the government asks permission from the people. In the other, the people have to ask permission from the government. And here's something that might surprise a lot of Canadians. The legal system that governs our rights today is actually not that old. Before 1982, Canada didn't have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms the way we know it today. Then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's dad, patriated the Constitution from Britain and introduced the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which became the supreme law of the land in Canada. And don't get me wrong, the Charter actually has some important protections, but it's worth remembering that something that the Canadian system is treated as sacred constitutional law today was written in the early 1980s. This is in the era of cassette tapes and mullets and VHS players. So the idea that the Charter is some ancient, untouchable foundation isn't exactly accurate. It's relatively new. It was written within living memory. And yet it's often treated like it descended from the heavens on stone tablets or something. But here's the other uncomfortable reality. A right on paper doesn't mean much if it can be suspended, ignored, or trampled on when it becomes inconvenient for the government, right? Take the peaceful protest or peaceful assembly, as it says, for example. The Charter clearly protects the rights of Canadians to gather and protest. But during the Canadian trucker convoy protest, we watched the federal government invoke the Emergencies Act on us. They froze our bank accounts. They trampled grannies with horses. And regardless of where you stood politically on the convoy, that moment revealed something important. And that's rights can become surprisingly flexible when the government decides a situation is an emergency. Or take property rights in Canada. Canada doesn't actually have strong constitutional protections for property ownership the way that the United States does. That means governments can expropriate property, they can restrict it, they can use it, they can regulate it in ways that dramatically change its value. And firearm confiscation is just one example where citizens legally purchase something under one set of rules to only have those rules rewritten later. So when people say, oh, don't worry, the Charter will protect your rights, it's worth asking a deeper question. Does it protect them? Or does it protect them only as long as the government and the courts decide the circumstances will allow it? Because if rights can be limited, if they can be suspended, if they can be interpreted to whatever a government claims necessity, then the real question becomes, how secure are those rights in the first place? And so you might ask, okay, well, if the Charter was only written in 1982, then couldn't it be rewritten? Technically, it could. Politically, it's nearly impossible. Changing the Constitution requires an agreement from the federal government and multiple provinces representing the majority of the population. In other words, the same country that didn't agree on pipeline construction or equalization payments would somehow have to agree on rewriting the foundation of its entire legal framework. right? Like, good luck with that. Like, we can't even agree what a woman is. So now contrast that with the United States. When the Americans wrote their Constitution, they had just fought a war against a tyrannical government, and they were deeply suspicious of centralized authority. And that's why the Second Amendment exists. It wasn't written so people could go like target shooting on the weekend. It was written to ensure that power ultimately rested with the citizens and not the government. And there's another layer. Many people believe that the Second Amendment ultimately protects the First Amendment, which is about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religious rights. And so the whole idea is that when a government knows a population is armed, it might think twice before trying to silence them. And even with the modern ways that we get silenced today through social media, we're sitting inside the beginnings of an AI singularity with AI already manipulating what we see as truth. I'd argue it's even more imperative for a Second Amendment because the attack against free speech in Canada and the United States isn't direct, it's subtle. And if you're not paying attention, it's slow. It's like boiling a frog in water and you don't realize your freedoms are gone until it's too late. So you can agree or you can disagree with that philosophy, but the point is that Americans built their country on a deep suspicion of government power. And Canadians, historically speaking, built their system on trust in government institutions. And so that brings us to the situation that's unfolding right now under Prime Minister Mark Carnage. And if you don't already know, right, like they've frozen our handguns. They've taken them all away from all of our stores. They prohibited thousands of firearms through an order in council without Parliament even sitting. Okay, and legal licensed gun owners like me have followed every rule. And now the government's working towards this national buyback program that will require owners to surrender those firearms in exchange for compensation, which there's not even any guarantee for. And so let's just pause for a moment and appreciate the brilliance of that political language here. It's not confiscation. No. That sounds aggressive. Instead, it's a buyback, which is interesting because the government never owned those firearms in the first place. And they're planning to come door to door and use the threat of force, which is extremely dangerous, like proposition that it puts law-abiding citizens at risk. All right, I'm not saying Canadians are going to like arm their houses to the teeth and go Rambo on police vehicles outside. But this is a situation where armed police are coming into your house, where your family and your kids are, and they're coming to steal your property from you. And this is like the most heated and delicate, precarious situation, and things happen in those situations, specifically if there's any instance of excessive use of force. Because taking guns away from people is not like you're there to impound their cars with a tow truck. And supporters of this say it improves public safety. Obviously, those people aren't very smart because if they actually took the time to look at the data and gain a general sense about the way things work in this country, they'd feel pretty dumb for believing such blatant lies. It punishes the most heavily vetted, law-abiding group of firearms owners in the world nearly. And it has nothing to do with stopping criminals who smuggle illegal guns across the border. And this is where the slippery slope conversation begins. Because once the government establishes the precedent that it can prohibit one category of firearms and demand that they be surrendered, people begin asking the obvious question. If it can happen once, what stops it from happening again? If one class of firearms can be prohibited today, why not another tomorrow? If the goal is absolute safety, why stop halfway? Why not prohibit every rifle and shotgun and handgun owned by civilians? After all, you give the government an inch of authority, history has a funny way of showing that it tends to take a mile. And what's next after that? Are they going to ban knives? Are they going to ban bear spray? Are they going to put governors on our cars so we can't drive 10 kilometers over the speed limit? If it seems like for our safety, somehow it scores some political points. So maybe we should start wearing hockey helmets and give people tickets for not doing up their chin straps properly or something. But this debate exposes something a lot deeper about Canada itself. The country is culturally divided on firearms, and the divide often follows lifestyle. In rural Canada, firearms are tools. People like me growing up learned firearm safety from a young age. Rifles mean food in the freezer, protection for livestock, and it's just traditions passed on through generations. In major urban centers, firearms are something entirely different. Many people haven't even held one, and their exposure only comes from crime stories on the evening news. So naturally, their perception becomes that guns are primarily instruments of violence rather than tools used by responsible, law-abiding citizens. And here's the political reality, is that elections are decided where the population lives. And in Canada, the population overwhelmingly lives in cities. And that means policies are often shaped by people whose experience with firearms are limited to what they see on the state broadcaster. Which brings us to this whole media mess that we're in. Did you know that Ottawa shovels $1.38 billion straight to the CBC a year, plus handouts to all the other legacy outlets? That's not journalism, that's a government mouthpiece. And when your funding comes from the politicians you're supposed to be watching and questioning, you toe the line or you lose your job. You spit out their narrative and nothing else. And then Canadians get fed one side of the story every day, and we still call this a democracy? That's state-controlled propaganda that's warping millions of minds. And all those factors shape how Canadians vote, how policies are formed, and why debates like this one feel so polarized. Because underneath the gun debate is a much bigger question about power. And right now in Canada, firearm ownership exists because the government allows it, not because the Constitution guarantees it. And that means the government ultimately decides where the line is drawn. So, the real questions that Canadians should probably start asking isn't about gun bans or buybacks or classifications. The real question should be, should the right to defend yourself ever be protected as a constitutional right in Canada? Or are Canadians comfortable living in a system where those rights exist only as long as the government decides they should? Because once you start thinking about that question, you realize this debate really isn't about firearms at all. It's about who ultimately controls the power in a free society. And so what happens when a country has no Second Amendment? Well, the balance of power changes. Rights that should belong to the people begin to depend on the goodwill of the government. And history shows that when governments hold all the power, they rarely give it up voluntarily. And without the ability for citizens to defend themselves, the people lose one of the last safeguards against government overreach. And a population that's disarmed, that's dependent, that's defenseless, becomes way easier to control. All right, well, there's some food for thought for your Sunday morning. Like, subscribe, comment. I'm sure we'd all love to hear what you have to say about this. Okay, bye for now.